The semi-detached home in Neasden, North London, presented a facade of suburban normalcy until the evening meal became a scene of biological warfare. In 1961, 14-year-old Graham Young sat at the dinner table, observing with clinical detachment as his stepmother, Molly, and father, Fred, were seized by violent retching and abdominal agony. The immediate aftermath was a blur of medical confusion, with doctors initially misdiagnosing the recurring afflictions as severe bilious attacks or gastric flu. Amidst the chaos of rushing ambulances and deteriorating health, Graham feigned concern, positioning the tragedy as a string of unfortunate natural ailments or perhaps accidental food spoilage. He curated an image of a hapless bystander, masking the reality of the extensive collection of poisons hidden in his bedroom. However, the alibi of bad luck and accidental ingestion collapsed under forensic scrutiny. When authorities finally analyzed the biological evidence following Molly's eventual death, the toxicology report delivered a verdict that defied natural causes. The analysis revealed not a pathogen, but massive systemic loads of antimony. The scientific data stripped away the lie of an accident, exposing the family dinner table as a calculated testing ground for the boy who would become known as the Teacup Poisoner. Before we continue with this disturbing case, please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing these important stories to light. The story of the Neasden poisonings begins not with a corpse, but with the quiet, suffocating normality of a semi-detached house on the North Circular Road in London. It was 1961, a time when post-war Britain was settling into a rhythm of suburban stability, and the young family appeared to be no exception to this dull, comforting rule. Fred Young, an engineer, worked hard to provide for his household. His wife Molly kept the home with a fastidious attention to detail, while their daughter Winifred navigated the typical social currents of young adulthood. And then there was Graham. At 14 years old, Graham Young did not fit the archetype of the rebellious teenager or the sporting enthusiast. He was a boy composed of sharp angles and silence, his dark hair slicked back with a severity that aged him, his eyes often described as devoid of warmth, staring out from a face that betrayed nothing of the churning intellect behind it. To the neighbors, he was merely the quiet boy who kept to himself. To his family, he was an enigma, a source of friction that no one could quite articulate, a fracture in the domestic porcelain that was slowly, invisibly widening. The roots of this fracture ran deep, burying themselves in the soil of Graham's early childhood. His biological mother, Bessie, had died of tuberculosis when he was just 3 months old, a loss that severed the primary bond of infancy. For the first few years of his life, Graham was shuffled into the care of his aunt, while his father, Fred, struggled to cope with grief and the demands of work. When Fred eventually remarried and brought Graham back into the fold of the nuclear family at the age of 2, the boy did not return as a son grateful for reunion, but as a displaced entity, an observer entering a world that had seemingly moved on without him. The arrival of Molly, his stepmother, catalyzed a resentment that would fester for over a decade. Graham was a child who did not bond. He observed. He watched the interactions between his father and Molly with a detached, clinical scrutiny, feeling like an interloper in his own home. This emotional isolation became the crucible for his obsession. While other boys collected stamps or kicked footballs in the local park, Graham collected poisons. His bedroom became a shrine to chemistry, a sanctuary where he could exert the control he felt he lacked in the messy, emotional world of human relationships. It started innocently enough with a chemistry set, a common gift for an intelligent boy in the 1950s. But Graham's ambitions quickly outgrew the safety of copper sulfate and vinegar. He began to acquire substances that had no place in a child's plaything. He idolized the Victorian poisoners, men like William Palmer and Dr. Crippen, not as villains, but as pioneers of a dark art. He read about them with the fervor of a religious zealot, memorizing the lethal doses, the symptoms, and the fatal errors that led to their capture. He was fascinated by the power of the invisible agent, the way a pinch of white powder could bring a grown man to his knees, stripping away his strength and dignity until he was nothing more than a biological machine malfunctioning in real time. By the age of 13, Graham was dressing in long trousers and lowering his voice to pass for 17, successfully purchasing antimony, digitalis, and arsenic from local chemists who saw only a serious, scientific-minded young man, not a budding predator. The atmosphere inside the young household in late 1960 and throughout 1961 transformed from merely tense to physically toxic. It began with what the family assumed was a run of bad luck, a series of minor ailments that seemed to plague them one by one. This was the testing phase, the calibration of dosages. Graham was not yet seeking to kill, but to experiment. He viewed his family not as kin, but as guinea pigs, biological substrates upon which he could test the efficacy of his compounds. He kept a diary, a chillingly precise record of his activities, noting the substances administered and the physiological reactions that followed. In these pages, there was no malice, only curiosity. He wrote of his father and stepmother with the same clinical detachment a biologist might use to describe the twitching of a dissected frog. The invisible fractures in the family were no longer just emotional. They were becoming physiological. Molly was the primary target of his early ire. The friction between stepmother and stepson was palpable, often manifesting in arguments about Graham's strange habits or his refusal to engage with the family. Graham's response was silent and chemical. Molly began to suffer from bilious attacks, sudden onsets of vomiting and excruciating stomach cramps that would leave her bedridden for days. The doctors, puzzled by the recurring nature of the illness and the lack of a clear viral cause, labeled it as biliousness or a gastric flu, generic diagnoses that provided cover for Graham's work. He watched her decline with a hawk-like intensity, noting how the antimony tartrate he slipped into her tea or sprinkled over her food mimicked natural gastrointestinal distress. He was learning the art of camouflage. He learned that antimony, a heavy metal used in the past as a medicine but lethal in high doses, created symptoms indistinguishable from common stomach bugs to the untrained eye. He saw how the doctors failed to ask the right questions, how they overlooked the pattern, and this emboldened him. It validated his superiority. But the sickness was not confined to Molly. Fred, a sturdy man used to physical labor, found himself doubled over with cramps that felt like fire in his gut. Winifred, his sister, was violently ill on several occasions while traveling to work, instances that Graham monitored with interest. He even extended his experiments outside the home. His school friend, Christopher Williams, became a subject of his curiosity. Graham shared his sandwiches with Christopher, sandwiches laced with carefully measured doses of poison. He watched his friend grow paler, watched him miss school, and when Christopher returned, Graham was there to welcome him back, ready to administer the next dose. It was a game of brinkmanship, pushing the victims to the edge of tolerance without crossing the line into immediate lethality, maintaining a state of chronic suffering that fed his need for dominance. The terror of the Neasden poisonings lies in the intimacy of the violence. This was not a stranger lurking in the alleyway. This was the boy sitting across the dinner table, passing the salt, pouring the tea. The family dinner, the symbol of domestic unity, became the delivery system for their destruction. Graham would sit and eat amongst them, his face a mask of indifference, while their bodies processed the toxins he had prepared. He was the architect of their misery, yet he played the role of the concerned son and brother. When Molly was writhing in pain, he would sometimes hover in the doorway, asking how she felt, not out of empathy, but to gather data. He needed to know if the dosage was sufficient, if the symptoms matched the textbooks he studied late into the night. The disconnect between his external persona and his internal reality was absolute. There was no conscience to check his hand, only the scientific method. As 1961 bled into 1962, the severity of the symptoms escalated. The Neasden bug, as the neighbours began to call it, seemed to have taken permanent residence in the young household. Molly's condition deteriorated rapidly. She lost weight, her skin took on a greyish pallor, and she developed a resistance to the treatments the doctors prescribed. She was slowly being hollowed out from the inside. Graham's experiments were becoming more aggressive. He had moved beyond simple curiosity and was now flirting with the ultimate power of life and death. He began to mix poisons, combining antimony with other compounds to see how they interacted, creating cocktails of misery that defied medical explanation. The house smelled faintly of sickness and the metallic tang of vomit, a sensory backdrop to the daily routine of a family under siege. Graham's arrogance grew with his success. He began to boast at school about his knowledge of toxicology, showing off vials of white powder to classmates who laughed it off as the eccentricities of the professor, a nickname they had given him. They did not know that the powder was real, that the experiments he bragged about were being conducted on living human beings. He carried the toxicology of his crimes in his pocket, a walking laboratory of death. Teachers found his obsession disturbing, but did not grasp the magnitude of the danger. He was dismissed as a strange, maladjusted boy, a problem to be managed rather than a threat to be neutralized. This underestimation was the shield behind which Graham operated. Adults could not conceive that a 14-year-old boy, wearing his school uniform, could be capable of such calculated systemic cruelty. They saw the child, not the chemist. The invisible fractures reached a breaking point on a Saturday in early 1962. Molly was in agony. The antimony had accumulated in her system, reaching levels that her body could no longer tolerate. Her nervous system was under assault, her organs straining under the toxic load. Graham watched it all. He knew, with the precision of the expert he aspired to be, that she was nearing the end. Yet he did not stop. He did not recoil in horror at what he had done. Instead, he continued to administer the poison, driven by a compulsion that had completely overridden his humanity. He was no longer just experimenting. He was executing a process. The lie he would later tell, that it was an accident, a slip of the hand, a misunderstanding of the chemicals, was already being constructed in his mind. He was preparing his defense even as he ensured there would be a victim. The tragedy of the young family was their trust. They trusted the sanctity of their home. They trusted the food on their plates. They trusted the boy who lived in the back room. They could not see the invisible fractures because they were looking for a monster, and all they saw was Graham. They saw a son who was perhaps a bit odd, a bit distant, but certainly not a killer. This blindness was the catalyst for the catastrophe. It allowed Graham to operate in plain sight, to turn the kitchen into a mortuary prep room. The toxicology report that would eventually crush his lies was still in the future, a damning document that would catalogue the exact milligrams of betrayal found in the bodies of his victims. But in the months leading up to the end, there were no reports, only the silent, agonizing progression of the poison. By the time the true nature of the Neasden bug was revealed, the damage had been irrevocably done. The background of this case is not just a history of events. It is a study in the failure of perception. It is the story of how a 14-year-old boy exploited the blind spots of the adult world, using his youth as a cloak for his malice. Graham Young did not just poison his family's bodies. He poisoned the very idea of the family unit, turning care into harm and sustenance into suffering. The fractures were there all along, in the cold stare, the locked room, the obsession with death. But they were invisible to those who refused to believe that evil could wear the face of a child. As the ambulance eventually pulled away from the house on the North Circular, carrying the broken body of his stepmother, Graham stood watching, the data point finally complete, the experiment concluded, his lie ready to be spoken. But chemistry, unlike people, does not lie. The elements he used would remain in the tissues, a permanent molecular testament to the truth that was about to come crashing down. The semi-detached house on the North Circular Road in Neasden, North London, presented a facade of post-war suburban normalcy in the early months of 1962. Inside, however, the air was thick with an invisible metallic tension. 14-year-old Graham Young sat at the dinner table, his demeanor quiet and observant, his eyes tracking the movements of his family members with the cold detachment of a vivisectionist. The Young household had become a laboratory, and the dinner table was the primary testing ground. The domestic routine of the working-class family was punctuated by the clinking of cutlery and the passing of condiments, mundane actions that Graham had weaponized. The family had been plagued by a mysterious and relentless illness for months. Fred Young, the patriarch, complained of stomach cramps that doubled him over, a burning sensation in his gut that no antacid could quell. Winifred, Graham's sister, suffered bouts of violent nausea on her train rides to work, her complexion turning a sickly grey. But it was Molly Young, Graham's stepmother, who bore the brunt of the affliction. The relationship between stepmother and stepson had long been corrosive, defined by mutual resentment and cold silences, but recently, Molly's suffering had transcended emotional friction and manifested as acute physical agony. She attributed her vomiting, the pins and needles in her extremities, and her crushing fatigue to a bilious attack, or perhaps the lingering effects of a minor bus accident she had suffered previously. She did not know that her decline was being meticulously engineered, milligram by milligram, by the boy sitting across from her. The escalating events of that spring hinged on Graham's acquisition and administration of antimony, a toxic chemical element that mimics the symptoms of natural gastrointestinal illness. He had purchased it under the guise of scientific curiosity, presenting himself to local chemists as an aspiring student with a precocious interest in compounds. In reality, he was administering tartar emetic, a compound of antimony, into the food and drink prepared in the small kitchen. The specific vehicle for the poison varied. Sometimes it was dissolved in the tea, the bitterness masked by sugar and milk. Other times, it was dusted over prepared meals. On a Saturday in April, the experiment reached its critical threshold The meal prepared that day was typical of the era, a heavy, starch-laden dinner intended to comfort and sustain. For Molly Young, it would be the catalyst for a total systemic collapse. Graham watched as she ate. The clinical reality of antimony poisoning is a horrific progression. Once ingested, the irritant action on the mucous membrane of the stomach is almost immediate. The body, recognizing the intrusion of a heavy metal, attempts to purge it. However, Graham had been dosing the family cumulatively. This was not a sudden, massive overdose intended to kill instantly, which would arouse immediate suspicion, but a chronic introduction of toxin designed to simulate a wasting disease. But on this specific occasion, the threshold was crossed. Whatever tolerance Molly's body had built up, or whatever reserve of strength she possessed, shattered. The agony was not merely nausea, it was a neural firestorm. Antimony inhibits the enzymes necessary for cellular metabolism. As the meal digested, the poison entered her bloodstream, attacking the heart muscle and the liver. The dining room, usually a place of quiet chewing and radio broadcasts, became the scene of acute distress. Molly complained of a stiff neck and a searing pain radiating through her abdomen. The pain was so intense it caused her skeletal muscles to spasm. Graham remained an observer. He did not panic. He did not rush to the telephone. He catalogued the symptoms mentally, comparing the reality of his stepmother's writhing form against the descriptions he had read in his textbooks on toxicology. He noted the pallor of her skin and the specific timbre of her groans. To the rest of the family, this was a terrifying flare-up of the bug that had haunted them. To Graham, it was data. The subsequent hours were a blur of confusion and misdiagnosis. Molly was in the backyard when the pain became unbearable. She was found in a state of distress that defied simple explanation. Her husband, Fred, frantic and suffering from his own sublethal dosing, sought help. When emergency services were eventually engaged, the prevailing theory remained focused on trauma or natural illness. The shadow of the bus accident Molly had been involved in provided a convenient, albeit incorrect, narrative hook for the doctors. They suspected a prolapsed disc or some form of spinal trauma resulting from the collision. This misdirection was Graham's greatest ally. Poisons like antimony and thallium, which he had also begun to experiment with, were archaic, rarely seen in modern clinical settings in London. A general practitioner or an emergency room doctor in 1962 would not look at a vomiting middle-aged woman and immediately suspect heavy metal poisoning administered by a teenager. Molly Young was taken to the hospital, but the damage was irreversible. The antimony had ravaged her heart. On April 21, 1962, Molly Young died. The cause of death was officially recorded as a prolapsed intervertebral disc and pneumonia, a tragedy of bad luck and a weakened constitution. The toxicology report that would later shatter this conclusion did not exist yet. Graham had succeeded. He had committed a murder in plain sight, masked by the banality of a family dinner and the ignorance of the medical establishment. However, the death of the test subject did not end the experiment. It merely removed one variable. In the weeks following the funeral, the sickness in the house did not abate. Fred Young became critically ill. He was admitted to the hospital with symptoms that baffled the specialists: hair loss, weight loss, and excruciating peripheral neuropathy. It was the Young family curse, or so the neighbours whispered. But Graham's arrogance began to outpace his caution. He was not content with the silent success of his crime. He needed validation. The investigation that eventually unravelled Graham's lie did not begin with Scotland Yard kicking down the door, but within the classrooms of his school. Graham was a poor student in most subjects, but his knowledge of chemistry was savant-like. He corrected his teachers. He drew diagrams of Bunsen burners and molecular structures on his desk. He boasted to his peers. One specific interaction proved pivotal. He spoke to a teacher, Mr. Hughes, about the properties of poisons with a level of detail that raised alarms. He discussed the lethal doses of thallium, a substance used in rat poison but obscure to the average schoolboy. The school administration, disturbed by his obsession and aware of the strange illness devastating his family, contacted the police. It was a decision made out of an abundance of caution, not a direct accusation of murder, but it set the gears of the forensic machine in motion. Detective Sergeant Shears was assigned to look into the matter. He was a seasoned officer, but he was unprepared for the psychological anomaly that was Graham Young. When the police arrived at the house in Neasden to interview Graham, they were not looking for a killer. They were looking for a troubled boy who might be mishandling dangerous chemicals. Graham, however, invited the scrutiny. He viewed the police much as he viewed his family, as intellectually inferior subjects to be toyed with. But he had made a critical error. He had kept notes. In the search of Graham's person and his room, officers discovered vials of liquid and powder. More damningly, they found a pocket diary. This was not a diary of teenage angst, but a logbook of death. In it, Graham had recorded the dosages administered to his father, his sister, and his stepmother. He had used codes and abbreviations, but the correlation between the dates of the entries and the dates of the family's severe illnesses was undeniable. Graham was taken into custody for questioning. The interrogation room was stark, a sharp contrast to the cluttered domesticity of the Neasden home. Here, the accident lie was presented. Graham initially claimed that his interest in chemistry was purely academic. He admitted to having the chemicals antimony, thallium, digitalis, atropine, but insisted he used them for experiments that had gone wrong, or that any contamination of the family's food was a result of negligence, a tragic mistake of a budding scientist who didn't wash his beakers. He spun a narrative of a boy who loved science but lacked safety protocols. This defense relied on the assumption that there was no physical proof of intent. Graham believed that since Molly was already buried and certified as a natural death, and his father was alive, the police could not prove he had deliberately poisoned them. He banked on the ambiguity of the symptoms. The turning point, the moment the accident narrative was crushed under the weight of scientific fact, came with the involvement of forensic pathologists and psychiatrists, including Dr. Christopher Fish. The police, armed with the diary and the suspicious vials, ordered a forensic analysis of the evidence. The analysis of the white powder found in Graham's possession confirmed it was antimony tartrate. The liquid was thallium. But the physical possession was only half the equation. The timeline was the key. The investigators correlated the accidents Graham described with the medical records of Fred and Molly Young. The toxicology report on the vials combined with the clinical review of Fred Young's symptoms painted a picture that was impossible to attribute to negligence. Fred was suffering from classic thallium poisoning. The specific pattern of hair loss, alopecia, and the dark lines on his fingernails, known as Mises lines, were biological receipts of the toxin's presence. These were not symptoms that could occur from trace contamination or a dirty beaker. They required sustained, significant ingestion. The interrogation shifted. Confronted with the specific symptomatology of his father, Details that only a poisoner or a doctor would understand. Graham's facade of the clumsy student began to dissolve. The detectives pressed him on the accident. How, they asked, did an accident result in the precise, repeated dosing required to produce Mace's lines? How did an accident result in the exact amount of antimony needed to stop Molly Young's heart without causing immediate throat constriction, implying the poison was masked in food or drink? Graham, realizing that his scientific superiority was being challenged by actual science, dropped the mask. His ego demanded that he be recognized not as a clumsy child, but as a master chemist. He began to correct the detectives on the properties of the poisons. He explained the pharmacokinetics of the drugs he used. He detailed how he had mixed the antimony into the food, how he had calculated the lethal dose versus the incapacitating dose. The confession was not an emotional unburdening. It was a technical correction. He admitted that the accident was a fabrication. He had poisoned the family dinner. He had watched them eat. He had monitored the results. He spoke of the power he felt in holding their lives in his hands, deciding who would suffer and who would die. The toxicology report and the medical analysis of his father's condition had acted as a mirror, forcing Graham to admit his competence to claim the credit. The investigation retroactively focused on Molly. While her body had been buried, the new evidence rendered the original death certificate worthless. The police realized they were dealing with a matricide. Graham's admission detailed the specific meal, the Saturday dinner, where he had decided to escalate Molly's dosage. He described the bilious attacks as successful milestones in his project. The final crushing of the lie came when the full scope of his experiments was revealed. He had not just poisoned the family, he had poisoned a school friend as well, sharing his toxic sandwiches. The breadth of the poisoning proved that this was a compulsive, directed behavior, completely incompatible with the accident defense. The diary entries, decrypted, showed a chilling anticipation of death. One entry, referring to his father, questioned why the man was taking so long to die despite the dosage. Graham Young was charged. The 14-year-old boy, who had turned his family dinner table into a slaughterhouse, was no longer a confused student in the eyes of the law. He was a predator. The toxicology reports and the forensic analysis of his lab supplies provided the absolute factual grounding that stripped away any doubt. The meal was not a meal. It was a delivery system. The agony was not a bug. It was murder. And the investigation, driven by the astute observations of a teacher and the methodical work of the police, exposed the darkness sitting at the head of the table. Graham was committed to Broadmoor Hospital, a high-security psychiatric facility, having been found unfit to plead due to a personality disorder. The experts labelled him a psychopath. The accident was officially dead, buried under the weight of antimony and thallium, leaving only the chilling reality of the Teacup Poisoner. The clinical precision he idolized had ultimately been the tool used to dismantle his freedom. The family dinner in Neasden remained a macabre historical marker. The moment when a teenage boy served death with a side of vegetables, and for a short, terrifying while, got away with it. The atmosphere inside the Old Bailey on July 6, 1962, was thick with a tension that belied the age of the defendant standing in the dock. Graham Frederick Young, a 14-year-old schoolboy with a pale face and an intense, unblinking stare, faced the court not as a juvenile delinquent caught in a scuffle, but as a calculated architect of chemical agony. The charge sheet was a litany of betrayal, administering poison to his father, Fred Young, his sister Winifred, and his school friend, Christopher Williams. while the ghost of his stepmother, Molly Young, hovered over the proceedings, her death months earlier having been officially attributed to natural causes despite the suspicious circumstances. The legal battle at hand focused on the living victims. The sentencing phase would not merely determine where Graham Young would spend his next years, but would fundamentally define the nature of his actions. It was a contest between the defense's characterization of a scientific accident born of curiosity and the cold, irrefutable narrative provided by the toxicology report. The defense counsel, Mr. T.R. Fitzwalter Butler, faced a Herculean task. His client had already admitted to the administration of the substances. The strategy, therefore, was not to deny the act, but to reframe the intent. Butler painted a portrait of Graham Young that was almost sympathetic, a boy possessed by a singular, overwhelming obsession with chemistry. The defense argued that Graham was a medical freak, a prodigy whose intellect had outpaced his morality, but whose fundamental drive was curiosity rather than malice. They posited the accident lie, the idea that Graham had been conducting experiments to test the human threshold for certain compounds, and that the poisonings were clinical tests that had spiraled out of control rather than attempted murders. They suggested that the boy did not fully comprehend the lethality of his hobby, framing the dinner table poisonings as the misguided workings of a scientific mind lacking a moral compass, rather than the machinations of a killer. This narrative relied heavily on the perception of Graham as a child, naive, detached, and perhaps unaware of the true gravity of biological cessation. The defense attempted to minimize the horror by intellectualizing it, suggesting that the antimony found in the family's food was placed there by a boy who viewed his family not as victims, but as test subjects in a benign, if dangerous, inquiry. However, this characterization crumbled the moment the Crown began to lay out the specifics of the medical and toxicological evidence. The prosecution did not need to rely on emotional pleas. They had the toxicology report, a document that acted as a mathematical dismantling of the accident theory. The clinical data presented to the court transformed the abstract idea of poison into a terrifying reality of calculated dosage and physiological devastation. The substance in question was antimony potassium tartrate, known colloquially as tartar emetic. The toxicology experts explained that while antimony shares chemical properties with arsenic, its effects on the human body are distinct and crucially, agonizingly slow when administered in small chronic doses. The report detailed the mechanics of the poison, crushing the defense's suggestion of a mere experiment gone wrong. An experiment implies a hypothesis and a variable. The toxicology results indicated a campaign of attrition. The court heard how antimony works as a cellular poison, disrupting the metabolic processes of the body. The experts highlighted that the symptoms suffered by Fred Young, excruciating stomach cramps, violent vomiting, and peripheral neuritis, were not the result of a single accidental overdose or a clumsy splash of chemicals into a stew. They were the result of systemic, repeated administration. The toxicology report revealed that the levels of antimony required to induce such severe peripheral neuropathy, the numbness and pain in the hands and feet that Fred Young had complained of for weeks, implied a sustained dosage over a prolonged period. This was not a one-time test. This was a daily ritual. The prosecution used the toxicology findings to reconstruct the timeline of the family dinners. The report corroborated the medical history of the victims with chilling precision. Every time Fred Young fell ill, it correlated with the presence of Graham preparing tea or serving food. The clinical precision of the symptoms, specifically the constriction of the throat and the sensation of burning in the chest, matched the profile of antimony poisoning perfectly. The toxicologist's analysis showed that the doses were increasing. The accident lie posited that Graham didn't mean to kill. The toxicology report proved that he was walking his father right up to the edge of death, pulling him back and then pushing him further. The accumulation of the toxin in the victim's systems was proof of a deliberate, controlled escalation. Furthermore, the accident defense was decimated by the evidence found on Graham's person at the time of his arrest. The police had discovered a small vial containing 70 grains of antimony potassium tartrate in his pocket. The toxicological expert testimony clarified the significance of this amount to the court. 2 grains could be fatal to an adult male. Graham Young was walking around with enough poison to kill 35 people. The defense could not explain away 70 grains as a residue from a chemistry set. It was an arsenal. The juxtaposition of the lethal quantity carried in a schoolboy's pocket against the defense's claim of scientific curiosity exposed the absurdity of the lie. A scientist keeps dangerous reagents in a secure locker. A killer keeps them in his pocket, ready for opportunity. The Crown also utilized the toxicology of the sister, Winifred, to reinforce the malicious intent. Winifred had suffered similar, though less severe, symptoms. The pattern of her illness mirrored her father's, establishing a control group in Graham's twisted methodology. The toxicological evidence showed that she had ingested belladonna alkaloids in addition to antimony. The mixture of poisons, antimony to destroy the body and belladonna from the deadly nightshade plant to induce hallucinations and delirium, spoke to a sophistication that evaporated any notion of childish error. The report detailed how these substances interact, causing a terrifying duality of physical collapse and mental instability. The accident lie could not account for the synergy of multiple toxins. This was not a mistake. It was a recipe. The most damning aspect of the medical evidence was the visual manifestation of the toxicology. The court was reminded of the physical state of Fred Young, who had withered away before his family's eyes, his skin turning sallow, his nerves dying. The clinical description of peripheral neuritis in the report, the dying of the nerve endings, served as a visceral counterpoint to the defense's sterile arguments. The toxicology report gave a voice to the suffering of the victims, translating their pain into irrefutable data points that pointed the finger directly at the boy in the dock. As the medical evidence mounted, the psychiatrist for the defense, Dr. Christopher Fish, and the prison medical officer, Dr. Donald Blair, were called upon to interpret Graham's mind in light of these chemical facts. Dr. Fish testified that Graham was a psychopathic personality, a label that, in 1962, carried a heavy weight. He argued that Graham was indifferent to the feelings of others, a trait consistent with the cold calculation revealed by the toxicology. However, the defense tried to use this to argue for a hospital order rather than a criminal sentence, positing that his obsession was a pathology to be treated. But the sheer competence revealed by the toxicology report made it difficult to view Graham simply as a patient. He was a proficient chemist. He knew the lethal doses. He knew the symptoms. He monitored the effects. The lie that he was just messing around was contradicted by the proficiency with which he nearly killed his father. He had successfully masked the taste of the antimony in pickles and tea, a feat requiring knowledge of the substance's metallic tang. The toxicology report proved he was not just experimenting with chemicals, he was experimenting with evasion. The prosecution's cross-examination and presentation of the chemical facts left the accident narrative in tatters. They highlighted that Graham had admitted to the police I could have killed them if I wanted to. The toxicology report proved that he could have, and that he was doing so, slowly. The only reason Fred Young was alive was that Graham had been caught. The lethal potential found in his possession and the levels in the victims' bodies showed that this was not a boy playing with a chemistry set, but a predator refining his craft. Justice Melford Stevenson, presiding over the case, listened intently. The weight of the toxicology report, the sheer objective reality of the poisons used, seemed to permeate the bench. When it came time to pass sentence, the judge did not mince words. The accident defense had failed to gain traction against the hard science. Justice Stevenson looked down at the 14-year-old boy, whose face remained an impassive mask. "You are extremely lucky not to be charged with murder," Justice Stevenson intoned, a reference to the death of the stepmother Molly, whose cremation had destroyed the toxicological evidence that likely would have condemned Graham to an even darker fate. But regarding the living victims, the science was clear. The judge acknowledged the psychiatric testimony, but was ultimately swayed by the danger the boy posed, a danger quantified by grains of antimony and belladonna. The accident lie was officially crushed when Justice Stevenson delivered his ruling. He did not send Graham to a standard juvenile detention center, nor did he treat the incident as a mere delinquency. He ordered that Graham Young be detained in Broadmoor Hospital, a high-security psychiatric hospital for the criminally insane, for a period of 15 years. The sentence was a recognition of the clinical horror detailed in the reports. The judge effectively ruled that a mind capable of such precise toxicological malice was too dangerous to be free. The toxicology report had done its job. It had stripped away the facade of the innocent schoolboy and revealed the toxicologist lurking beneath. It proved that the dinners were not meals, but crime scenes, that the symptoms were not illnesses, but injuries, and that Graham Young was not a scientist, but a budding serial killer. As Graham was led away to Broadmoor, the silence in the courtroom returned, heavy with the realization that the 14-year-old boy's accident was, in fact, a masterpiece of attempted homicide, written in the language of chemistry and exposed by the unyielding truth of the toxicology report. The revelation that 14-year-old Graham Young had systematically dosed his family with antimony and thallium did not merely solve a legal mystery, it detonated the psychological foundation of the Young household. For Fred Young, the survival of the poison was arguably a crueler fate than the death his wife Molly suffered. The toxicology report had stripped away the comforting veil of coincidence, replacing it with the clinical reality of chronic, intentional intoxication. Fred was left to reconcile the image of his quiet, chemistry-obsessed son with the cold-blooded entity who had watched him vomit violently day after day, noting the symptoms with scientific detachment. The physical ravages of the poison, including the numbness in the extremities and gastric agony, were mirrored by a profound emotional paralysis. He had defended Graham against Molly's earlier suspicions, a fact that would haunt him as a complicit silence in his own wife's murder. Winifred, Graham's sister, carried a different burden. She had been the test subject for his belladonna experiments long before the heavy metals appeared at the dinner table. Her survival was a matter of dosage, not mercy. In the aftermath, the domestic intimacy of a shared meal transformed into a source of traumatic memory. The mundane clatter of cutlery and the pouring of tea were no longer signs of familial bonding, but triggers of a lethal betrayal. The trust essential to family life had been metabolized into fear. The home in Neasden became a crime scene, where the perpetrator had sat across from the victims, offering water to soothe the very throats he had burned with chemicals. Graham himself provided no closure to the survivors. During the proceedings and his subsequent transfer to Broadmoor Hospital, he displayed an affect that chilled the assessing psychiatrists. There was no weeping child broken by a terrible mistake. Instead, there was a budding narcissist who viewed his family not as human beings, but as biological units reacting to chemical stimuli. He spoke of the lethal doses with the pride of a researcher publishing a successful study. This absolute lack of empathy created a vacuum where grief should have been. The family could not mourn a son lost to madness because Graham appeared terrifyingly sane, driven by a hyper-rational curiosity devoid of moral constraints. The legacy of the Neasden poisonings extended beyond the immediate emotional crater. It forced a re-evaluation of juvenile psychopathy in the British legal and medical systems. Dr. Patrick McGrath, the medical superintendent at Broadmoor, would later encounter a young man who treated the high-security psychiatric hospital as a postgraduate university for toxicology. Graham's incarceration was meant to be the end of the threat, but for Fred and Winifred, the knowledge that their suffering had been nothing more than data points in a teenager's notebook left a scar that no antidote could heal. The house on the North Circular Road stood empty of its mother, inhabited by a father broken by betrayal and a sister lucky to be alive, both living in the long shadow of the boy who sat at their table and waited for them to die. The silence that now surrounds the historical footprint of the Brooks family in Moses Lake, Washington, serves as a grim monument to a domestic bond severed not by external violence, but by internal chemistry. When 14-year-old Nathan Brooks carried plates of lasagna to the dinner table in 2013, he delivered more than a meal. He presented a lethal cocktail of antifreeze and crushed prescription medication designed to terminate his parents, John and Beth. Throughout the aftermath, Nathan attempted to cling to a narrative of accidental excess, suggesting his intent was merely to incapacitate the household or act out in frustration rather than to kill. However, the objective rigidity of forensic science dismantled this fabrication piece by piece. The toxicology reports provided an unyielding glimpse into the biological reality of the crime, revealing blood concentrations of ethylene glycol and sedatives that were mathematically incompatible with a mere prank or a cry for help. The specific mixture and dosage required a level of preparation that evidenced a sustained predatory commitment to a fatal outcome. This empirical data rendered the boy's accident lie untenable, forcing the legal system and the public to acknowledge the terrifying lucidity of his planning. Juvenile parricide remains one of the most disturbing anomalies in criminology because it inverts the biological imperative of survival, transforming the nurturer into the target and the dependent into the executioner. While John and Beth Brooks miraculously survived the physiological ravages of the poisoning, the family unit was effectively cauterized that night. The toxicology report did not just measure poison. It quantified the precise moment a child made the conscious decision to erase his own origin. Ultimately, the numbers on the page revealed what the boy's face could not: a clinical detachment that turned a family dinner into a calculated crime scene, proving that the most dangerous toxins are often those synthesized within the home itself.